This is your city. This is your city wants to know. We want to know the background, the heartbeat of what makes up our beautiful cities. We dig into the backstories, from the struggles to the successes of our local entrepreneurs, small business owners, artists, not-for-profit organizations, and the many, many people who make up the intricate tapestry of our communities. Real people, real stories, by you and for you. But wait, that's not it. I love giving my opinion. Just ask anyone who knows me. We can't get enough of the honest, gritty feedback of places that we spend our hard-earned money. I'll give you the good, the bad, and the ugly of the places I eat, sleep, and visit. Disclaimer, my opinion only. All right, so come on, let's get to it. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of This is Your City. I am Kim, your host. I don't even know where to start with my guest today. It's just something so different and so personal. But can you imagine, and I don't think any of us can, 16 years in prison and exonerated by DNA. Yeah. In 1991, Deskovic was convicted of raping and murdering a fellow high school student, and he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. And only after 16 years being spent in prison was Jeffrey exonerated by DNA. In March of 2012, after finally receiving the personal means to do so, Deskovic acted on a dream since his release of establishing an organization that would help free innocent people who are or who were wrongly convicted. And so he launched Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation of Justice, where he used $1.5 million of his own compensation from his own ordeal to make his dream come true. He wanted to take the negative and turn it into something positive, and to leave a legacy that, of course, would ultimately outlive him. And what I find really exciting is that he didn't stay there. What he did was he eventually went on and received a master's degree from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And then in May of 2019, Deskovic obtained a law degree from Pace University and was admitted to the New York State Bar in October of 2020. I just find that so exciting. My guest tonight, Jeffrey Deskovic. Hi, Jeffrey. Welcome to the show, and thank you for agreeing to sit with us. How are you?
I'm great. Very warm welcome. Thank you very much. I'm happy you're sharing your platform with me today, and I'm looking forward to this interview.
Awesome. I'm going to do something a little different than I normally do with my interviews. And when I sit with my guests, sometimes it's just like kind of having coffee and we just talk about stuff. But I feel like I need to honor you in a little bit where I get my facts straight. So during this interview, I might read off of some notes, and
Sure.
that's not something I typically do. But just so I don't get anything wrong, okay, I'm going to do that.
Yes.
This is real life, and most of us, thankfully, cannot comprehend this. So I want to get it right.
Sure.
You know, when you agreed to do this interview with me, I was over the moon, and I spent many nights poring over some court documents, some transcripts of your case. I also read through some papers that were from the National Registry of Exonerations.
Yes.
What interests me was a report that I found on your conviction, and it was prepared and requested by Janet DeFiore in Westchester. I think I got that right.
Westchester County. You did get that right.
Yeah.
You got all that right. Yes.
Thank you. The district attorney for there. And the reason that really caught my eye and interested me, because we don't often get the inside scoop of what the justice system and those involved did wrong, right? We don't really usually hear of that unless we watch the evening news or something. And this document, it was full of things that went wrong in your case, and yet you were still convicted. And if you don't mind, I'd like to go over a little bit of that before we get into the kind of behind the scenes stuff.
Sure, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, absolutely. How you steer the conversation up, and how whichever way you take it is what I'm going to follow along with.
Awesome. Okay, so let's start off with, they did not test hair samples found on
Right.
the body. They didn't even take sperm or blood samples of any other people who may have been involved in this case. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the caveat being that in terms of the hair, they did compare the hair to me, and they determined it didn't match me, that it actually was from Negroid and Mongoloid origin, which, I'm pretty much as white as you can get. So the prosecutor's explanation for the hairs is he argued by inference, he claimed, well, the hairs must have come from medical examiner who's Vietnamese and his African American assistant. But he never actually had samples collected from either of them so that the comparison could actually be made. He just made the argument by inference. And and you are correct that they tested the seminal fluid on the body versus me and found it didn't match me, but that's as far as the testing went. And then later on, as will unfold in the post-conviction process, I was blocked several times from having that DNA put into the DNA data bank once it had been created. So yeah, so far you're batting 1,000.
Oh my goodness. Now, I just want to get this out there because, people will go and read up on this later on and stuff. You did confess at first to this crime.
I did, yes, I was coerced into that, but yes.
Right. And we find that a lot, especially with young people. And, if we take the moment to read into some court case, because I love this kind of stuff, so I do read into it, we rarely find, we find a lot of similarities between your case and a lot of younger people being coerced into admitting something they didn't do. And, a lot of psychology and psychologists will say, like, the vulnerability of the brain and the lack of experience and fear in somebody younger, it's a lot easier to coerce a young person into a confession.
I agree 100%. I just want to add for context that coerced false confessions have caused wrongful convictions in 25% of the DNA proven wrongful convictions. And you correctly point out that while this has happened to adults, that particularly vulnerable populations are youth and people with mental health issues.
And I also read with people with lack of funding, like poorer people, they are typically as well coerced into false confessions. I don't know.
Right. Well, I mean, your inability to, yeah, I mean, that ties into, your ability to retain an attorney, and then also, the quality of representation that you get at the trial at which you're going to be challenging the confession. I mean, certainly if you have a paid lawyer, that, theoretically, they're going to mount a much more aggressive defense. I mean, just
Right.
and for context, and we're going to need this info later. Normally, when you defend a case, which is a false confession, you have to answer that confession. You have to explain that confession. You have to disprove that confession and bring it all together in your closing argument. But my attorney didn't do any of that. In addition, he was kind of all over the place. Sometimes he argued the confession never happened. Other times he argued, well, it happened, but it was coerced. At still other times he was arguing that it happened, but it was false. So
Yes.
you're already in a difficult spot just defending a case where there is a confession to begin with. There's an 80% conviction rate, but then when you're not going to allow your client to testify and you're going to just throw all these different theories against the wall and hope that something sticks, it's in a way, it's not that surprising that I was wrongfully convicted.
Exactly. And another thing is tape recordings.
Mhm.
They were all over. And in all of these transcripts that I'm reading, they talked about these transcripts. The tape recordings were shut off and on multiple times with a huge space. And when you confessed, everything prior to that was not on tape for a meaningful time period. They shut off those tapes multiple times. There is
So
no evidence of how they coerced you, but anybody, especially like in a court system, like a young man, you weren't even a man, you were a young boy, no evidence, the tapes are shut off, at all of these like convincingly, convincing areas. Why did you know these were being shut off at such a young age?
Well, I did not. But just to clarify something, so there was like a 6-week run up to the coerced false confession. So I had a lot of interaction with the police, and the dynamic there would be, first they would talk to me like a suspect, and then they would push too hard and I'd become frightened and I'd want to get away from them. That's when they would switch it up, and Jeff as this junior detective helper was the game that they were playing. Oh, the kids won't talk freely around us, they will around you. Let us know if you hear anything. Stop in from time to time. They'd ask me opinion questions and congratulate me that my opinion was correct. They did the good cop, bad cop routine. So I began to look up to the officer who was pretending to be my friend as a father figure, which I was particularly vulnerable to because my own father had never been in my life in any aspect. And prior to being a teenager, I wanted to be a cop when I grew up. So it was all during that 6-week run up to it that you correctly point out that, the audio tape was being started and then stopped. And I was not always aware of them doing that. I was aware that they did it once, but not after that. But in terms of the day of the coerced confession, none of that was audio tape, not even a second of it. There was no audio tape, there's no videotape, there's no signed confession. It's just the cop's word for it. And when they came to court, they were able to leave the threat and false promise out. So maybe this would be a good point just to take a brief minute or two, just to provide some context. So in terms of the day of the coerced false confession. So first of all, after that 6 weeks run up, they got me to agree to take a polygraph by telling me that there was some new information that had come into the police file and they wanted to share that with me. But I would first have to take and pass a polygraph. So the next day, rather than go to high school, I went to the police station for this test. My mother and grandmother, whom I lived, thought that I was in school because it was a school day. They drove me from Peekskill, which was in Westchester County, New York. They drove me across county lines, 40 minutes away by car, to the town of Brewster in Putnam County. So now it means that I'm not able to leave on my own anymore. I'm totally dependent on the police. They even continue the psychological overreaching of me, even in the car ride. They had me ride in a car by myself with the cop who was pretending to be my friend with the other two in a different vehicle. When I got there to the polygraph location, it was in a private office. It was not in a police station. The polygrapher was dressed like a civilian. He never identified himself as a police officer. He never read me my rights. There was no attorney present. I wasn't given anything to eat the whole time I was there. They gave me a 4-page brochure which explained how the polygraph worked. But I had a lot of big words in it, which I didn't understand.
Of course.
But then I figured, well, I'm here to help the police, so what does it matter? Let's just get on with it. And from there, they put me in a small room, and the polygraphist gave me countless cups of coffee in order to get me nervous. Then he wires me up to this machine, and then he launches into his third-degree tactic. So he invaded my personal space. He raised his voice at me. He kept asking me the same questions over and over again. And as each hour passes by, my fear increases in proportion to the time. And he kept that up for 6.5 to 7 hours, which, by the way, is more than double the maximum amount of time that, even as unscientific as the polygraph is, and it's not scientific at all. In fact, intelligence officers are even trained on how to beat the polygraph. But even being unscientific, it still has its own best practices, or, how it's supposed to be done. And by him having me on that thing for 6.5 to 7 hours, that was more than double the 3 hours which is the most they could see having somebody on it. And he also did not video or audio record it, which was another requirement for that method of conducting the polygraph, because there's such a high correlation between usage of the polygraph and coerced false confessions. So he does that for 6.5 to 7 hours. And towards the end, he said, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the test result that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm it." And that really shot my fear through the roof. And at that point, it was the officer who had been pretending to be my friend. He came in the room and told me that the other officers were going to harm me, but that he'd been holding them off, but I can't do so indefinitely, that I had to help myself. Then he added, just, just tell them what they want to hear. You can go home afterwards. You're not going to be arrested. Being young, naive, frightened, 16 years old, not thinking about the long term, just being concerned with my safety in the moment. I was in fear of my life. The fact that I didn't know where I was, and that no one else knew where I was either, loomed quite large in my mind. I was overwhelmed emotionally and psychologically,
And
and the
yeah,
possibility of harm and this false promise. So the end result was I made up a story based on the information that they had given me. By the time it was all said and done, I had collapsed on the floor into a fetal position and crying uncontrollably. And obviously I was arrested at that point. And they finally gave me something to eat after going all day without eating anything.
that's incredible. Of course you were fearful of your life. They were even, the good cop was even telling you that I can't hold them back any longer and they want to do you harm. Like that's in the back of your mind too, right?
Absolutely. Yes, it
Oh,
was.
that's
It
incredible.
was. And I just wanted to get out of there. And I was desperate. And by him throwing me that false promise, I mean, I latched onto that. It was down to that, and that was a lie, except I didn't realize that at the time.
I mean, for somebody who's lived a life, like a 40-year-old, 50-year-old, doesn't even matter. For somebody who's lived a life, you might be able to hold out for a little bit longer, but a 16-year-old boy, okay, for hours upon hours inside this room with people raising their voice, threatening them, we couldn't even handle it now at our age, let alone
Right.
at 16. But that's not it. That's not all, Jeffrey. There was a ton of stuff, like the courthouse cleaning crew, like they inadvertently threw away many of the much of the evidence, right? Like what was
Yes.
clothing.
Yeah, let me explain that. That's a wonderful point that you made. So the victim's clothes, including her bra, had been admitted into evidence, and the jury asked to see the bra. And that was important because in one of the statements that they coerced out of me, I said that I ripped her bra off, which there's some bras that cannot be ripped off. And so when the jury asked to see the bra, that's when the judge said, well, the clothes, including the bra, had been left in the courtroom over the weekend, and the janitors apparently thought it was trash, and so it was thrown out.
Oh my gosh.
And he refused to declare a mistrial, and he substituted the bra, which was no longer available, with a photograph, which the judge himself said, quote unquote, you can almost see the bra in it.
Oh no. Wow, that's incredible. And all of these errors that the police and the prosecution and even your own lawyer not
Right.
speaking, not asking,
Sure.
are all contributed to your conviction because
Yeah. 100%. Let me just put a little bit more color to that and get into a few more of the specifics of that. So in terms of the prosecutorial misconduct, so one day before officially getting the DNA test results back, he rushed to the grand jury to indict me so that he didn't have to present that to the grand jury. Once the DNA didn't match me, the medical examiner suddenly claimed that he remembered that he forgot to document medical evidence that he said showed the victim had been promiscuous, which is what opened the door for the prosecutor to argue that there must have been yet another person that she slept with prior to my murdering and raping her. And taking it a step further, he mentioned another youth by name that he claimed had this encounter with the victim. But much like the hair, he again resorted to arguing by inference rather than by evidence. He never got the DNA sample from this other youth. He never even called him as a witness. He just made the unsupported argument to the jury. And he got away with that because first of all, my attorney was conflicted, meaning that this other youth that the prosecutor was falsely saying had slept with the victim was another member of that same public defender's office, and specifically by the lawyer who was supposed to be supervising him on my case. So that conflict prevented the defense from asking him for a DNA sample. It prevented the defense from calling him as a witness. And another aspect of that was that the victim's family was not coming to court. So they had no idea that her reputation was being trashed like that. She wasn't promiscuous at all. And in fact, and they knew that. And the reason why I know that they knew that is because when the DNA did not match me, the police went back out into the field and they interviewed 17 witnesses who knew the victim in one capacity or another, and all of them told the police that there was no boyfriend, there was no consensual sex. But the police purposely did not document any of those witness interviews. And as a result of that, none of that was turned over to my attorney.
Wow.
Now, speaking of my attorney in terms of his deficiencies, rarely met with me. Whenever he would meet with me, he was always shutting me up. One time he told me he didn't care if I was guilty or innocent, which is a hell of a thing to say. Then he literally never asked that medical examiner a single question, never explained to the jury the significance of the DNA not matching me, never used that to challenge the confession or argue it was coerced and false. I mentioned about the conflict. And lastly, my attorney would not allow me to testify. And then he was all over the place, like I said before, in terms of his various arguments to the jury. And so that, along with all the other errors we talked about, led to the wrongful conviction. I just remember, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go.
I just remembered one more thing.
Yeah.
So not being content with having coerced a false confession out of me, they also falsely attributed a statement to me. What I mean by that is, once the DNA didn't match me, suddenly the police claimed that I said to them that I didn't know whether or not whether the perpetrator ejaculated or not. And that word was not in my vocabulary as a 16-year-old. And when you look at their police reports, that only appears in their police reports after the DNA doesn't match me. That did not appear in their reports prior to that.
Wow.
So add it all up, that was how I was wrongfully convicted.
Yeah, and as a 15-year-old or 16-year-old,
16-year-old, yeah.
As a 16-year-old, they're not, your attorney's going everywhere and he's not asking you, he's shutting you up. Like, I don't know if this is factual, but it would appear to me that in those circumstances, they wouldn't care anyway. Like, you wouldn't have had a say, even if you went up on the stand, which they did not allow you. Like, you wouldn't really have had a say after all of this. You couldn't go to your lawyer, hey, do this, do that, do this. You're 16 years old.
I clearly was in over my head, never been arrested before. I didn't fully understand what was going on. And that was a situation that my attorney made worse, because he would not allow my mother or any other adult to be in any of the conversations with him and I. For any of the strategic decisions, such as whether to take the stand, which I wanted to, he wouldn't let me, but then he gave me his rationale. He said, oh, it's not up to me to prove you're innocent. They got to prove you're guilty. But that's still a choice to make. You're still taking a risk, both ways. He wouldn't allow me to have the judgment of a mature adult in that conversation, just like he would not allow me to have the input of a mature adult on the issue of whether to have a bench trial or a jury trial.
Would you have known the difference back then?
If he explained it to me, I might have. But again, that's where having an adult with me to further elaborate, and maybe the adult would have understood the implications more. I might have been able to get like a basic understanding, but an adult would have understood the far-reaching implications, assuming that he explained it to them correct. But he didn't allow that. And speaking of that decision, by the way, I just remembered something, which was when that decision was still up in the air, even with my not being allowed to consult with an adult. My lawyer came to me one day and he told me that the judge came to him off the record and told him to pick a jury because he didn't want to be responsible for finding me not guilty.
Wow.
So that wasn't proper for the judge to limit my decision that way. And my lawyer was supposed to put that on the record and ask the judge to recuse himself, because, that sounds like this judge is letting the public pressure get to him. Yeah. And keeping in mind the context in which that every time I made a court appearance, it was this major media moment with virtually all the coverage from a guilt presumptive oriented perspective.
That's right. That's right. And there must have been a lot that, oh my goodness, I can't even imagine that as well. The media, the people with their cameras in your face, at 16 years old. I'm sure they're yelling. I mean, I watch movies, so I'm sure it's not like that, but they're yelling at you. People, it would have been terrifying.
It was very scary. It was very scary to me. So at that point, I was 17 because I turned 17, which is for the trial. It was still very, very scary, with the media there and seeing my name in newspapers, for something, like this, being on the cover of newspapers. It was a very, very frightening, out of control type of feeling.
Yeah. And I read some information too, Jeffrey, that New York is the third most DNA exonerated state in the US.
Correct.
So what that tells me is if it's the third most exonerated state from DNA,
that means it's the third. So that's another way of saying that, at least as amongst the exonerated cases, that New York wrongfully convicts fairly frequently.
And is it because, people got to get voted into office, so they have to close cases quickly? There's a lot of speculation of why that can be.
Well, there's a multitude of reasons. I mean, what you just said is one reason. I don't think that that's the only reason or the reason in every instance, but that's certainly an aspect of it. Another aspect would be tunnel vision, which is when a conclusion is formed, then working backwards and only trying to confirm that and ignoring evidence to the contrary, or trying to explain it away in a way that just kind of defies logic and common sense, such as the DNA not matching me. Then we're going to go to a consensual sex theory and promiscuity, but the victim is leading a sheltered life and has no boyfriend, but we're going to ignore that. There has to be a way that Deskovic did this crime, even though DNA says it was not. So tunnel vision, but other things, coerced false confessions, we mentioned that at 25%, misidentification at 75% of DNA-proven wrongful convictions, lying informants at 15%, bad lawyering, which was certainly a factor in my case, is prosecutorial misconduct is a factor that runs through nearly all of the wrongful convictions as an additional factor to the other things we've talked about. Forensic fraud, which certainly was present in my case through the medical examiner. And by the way, we did find during the lawsuit process after I was exonerated that this medical examiner had altered his findings in 3 other cases in order to better fit the prosecution theory. And in each one of those instances, the prosecutor was the prosecutor in my case. So they were used to tag teaming like that in a legal fashion.
Oh my gosh. Now, I don't know if you can answer this or not, but those other 3 cases that you know of that you just mentioned, were they exonerated?
No, they have not been exonerated. I'm not really clear whether those were innocent people or not. But certainly at a minimum, it's you could definitely say that none of them got a fair trial. And actually, one of the cases that I'm co-counsel on now, which maybe we'll get to a little bit later, this medical examiner is present in that case, and he altered his time of death. And that had the impact of canceling out the defendant's alibi.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I want to get into a little bit of a few different things here. So, and I know for lack of time, I don't want to feel like I'm rushing you, but I just want to know so much.
Go ahead. Listen, ask everything you want. And if need be, we could always do a part 2. I'm willing. It's certainly up to you, but it's on the table on my end of it. I would be willing to.
Oh, thank you so much for that. One thing I want you to explain to my viewers and my listeners, in case some of them don't know the difference, because I didn't know the difference at one time, the difference between being freed and exonerated.
So being exonerated is that the court recognized that you were innocent or you received a pardon from the governor on innocence grounds. Whereas being freed, you might be freed because you got paroled, or a lot of states have what's called a conditional release, meaning that there's a time period where they unless you've done something to lose good time, like say in the 5 to 15, like the middle point would be about 10 years. So that would be your conditional release. So you could be out that way, or you might have gotten out because the governor's office gave you a commutation, gave you what's called clemency, which means,
Yeah.
all right, well, there's some redeeming value in you, and that we think that merits you doing less time than what you were sentenced to, where sentence could be modified through commutation, or you might have been released because
You did
you
your
maxed
time.
out, you finished all
Yeah.
the time. On the 5 to 15, you somehow managed to do all 15 years, and so you maxed out. Or you might even be released at a compassionate release, whereby by coincidence, your health has just deteriorated to a point where the prison medical officials have determined that you're terminally ill. And so you've applied to be released through compassionate release so that you can die with a little bit of dignity with your friends and family in a normal environment. So you could have been out on any of those ways, but not exonerated. Or maybe your conviction was even overturned, but rather than you being exonerated or going to trial and winning, they offered you a plea bargain and, just plead guilty to this and we'll release you right away. And so you could be out that way, but not exonerated.
Right. Exonerated, you were found innocent of a
Innocent.
crime that you
Correct.
did not commit, but you were
Right.
convicted of or charged of. Yeah. That's incredible. And you had made a comment, and it's a quote that I took from you.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember where it was, forgive me, but it is a quote
Okay.
from you.
Yeah.
And it says, I don't get angry at what happened to me, because if I did, that would be like giving them the rest of my life, and they
Right.
already took enough from me.
Yes.
Instead, I take that energy that I otherwise would feel, and that drives me in my quest, in my lifelong struggle against wrongful convictions. When I first read that quote from you, Jeffrey, I actually teared up, because in my head I was thinking how angry you must be, because some of the most important years of a human being's life, you have your young teenage, your young adult, and your adult life. Like, yes, there's some who spend many, many more years, but you spent very, very, like, where you're learning everything, and everything changes in society. I was thinking to myself, those words are so humbling. I didn't get angry, because if I did, I'd be giving them the rest of my life, and they already took enough. That does not come easily for most people to get to that place. How did you get there?
Well, my first week home, I was angry. And at the end of the week, I mean, I felt like it was destroying me. And I figured, well, I want to enjoy my life as much as I can. I can't do that if I'm angry or bitter. If I was to be angry, it's not like I'm impacting the people who were responsible. And the other line of reasoning also, which you quoted, also went through my mind as well. So that was kind of how I got there. So maybe a month before I was released, whereby my conviction was overturned, and then I wound up going back to court and where I was exonerated. They dismissed everything on actual innocence grounds. But a month before the conviction was overturned, I saw on the television that there was another prisoner named Alan Newton who had been exonerated through DNA testing. And in his press conference, he said that he was not angry. And at the time, I thought that was like the silliest thing ever. And, but after that first week of being home and being angry and it nearly destroying me, I remembered that. I hearkened back to that, and hence my coming up with those multiple line of reasonings, all in that same direction.
Yeah. And I want to get into, in a few seconds, in a few minutes as well, that whole thing, how you were exonerated, what happened leading up to that. But something that we don't know, because we can only know what we read about your case
Right.
and about,
Sure.
so what we don't know. And again, I struggled with what to ask, because I don't want to, like, my ignorance and all of that could just
No, feel
trigger.
free to ask whatever you like. Feel free
Well,
to ask whatever you like. I'm very transparent, and if you do ask me something that I haven't heard before, I appreciate that. So look, feel free to ask whatever you want.
Okay. Well, 15, 16 years old, 17 by the time you went into prison.
Mhm.
Um, so first of all, did they put you in an adult prison at 17?
They did.
They put you right in with maximum security people, like people who have done atrocious things in life.
Yes, because I had been charged as an adult, tried as an adult, sentenced as an adult, and therefore it followed that I would be sent to an adult maximum security prison. Yes,
And how terrifying was that when you go through that
extremely.
process? You know,
Yeah,
they shower you, delice you. Do they still do that stuff?
they
I mean,
still do that stuff.
they did that
Yes,
back then. Delice
yes.
you, shower you, check you, do all of those very personal things to your body, give you your clothes and whatever it is you're going to be needing. Like, how terrified was it? Walk us through that just for a couple of moments of your memory.
Yeah, well, it was terrifying. I mean, they gathered all of us together in this one area, and they ordered us to take all of our clothes off so they could do the delicing, and so that was an unusual thing for me as well, just to be naked in front of all these other men, and then the delicing. I mean, I remember that smell stayed in my head for months. I couldn't get it out, even though I was showering and using shampoo. So that all that was frightening, and even just the fact of how menacing the barbed wire appeared, how large the prison wall loomed, and uh, the idea of being in prison where the COs were in charge. So in the county jail, I was kept in the mental health wing of the prison, where there were correction officers, but they really weren't in charge. The civilian mental health staff were in charge, and the guards had a secondary role just in terms of security. But
Right.
it was a minimal amount of interaction. Whereas in a prison, the correction officers are all in charge, and that in and of itself was kind of a frightening prospect. And then being in not being used to being in the prison walls. I mean, I felt claustrophobic there, and in that reception center, downstate correctional facility, which is when I say reception, that's the first state facility that I was sent to prior to going to a different prison, and that's where they issue the supplies, they delice you, they do medical and mental health observation, and then they try to an assessment, and they try to determine what facility you're going to be sent to originally. So in that particular prison, they had what was called a live count, meaning that 5 times a day they would come around, and you would have to be fully dressed, standing up at the door with your lights on. So it made it very difficult even just to sleep.
Right.
'Cause you could never really relax there, because if you're sleeping when they come around, you could get in a lot of trouble for doing that.
Wow. And the other prisoners, the men that were there with you, did you have anybody that took you under their wing? I mean, you were there for 16 years, so
Mhm.
maybe younger ones came in after you that you took under your wing. How did that
Sure. So
work?
both of those, yeah, that would be fair to say. So that both of those things happen at various times, and in various ways. I mean, sometimes the people that took me under their wing, it was that they gave me some advice here and there. It's not like they were my protector 24 hours a day. It wasn't
Yeah.
on that level. I mean, that happens sometimes. That never actually happened for me, but people did educate me. They kind of schooled me on, various prison survival, tactics, things like, when you're in your cell, don't talk out of your cell. Some people do that, but you never know who you're talking to, or someone might jump into the conversation, and don't ask anybody for anything. Don't let anybody take anything, from you. Don't try to be popular or overly familiar, and don't get, you don't want to gamble or get involved into borrowing something for somebody, or get into a discussion about what's going to be watched on the television or not.
Right.
And even trying to identify, which people around you are in what gangs, and steering clear of them, because, if you're hanging out with somebody, that could draw you into something that you don't want to be involved in.
That's right. Wow. There's a lot to know. There's a lot to know. Did you take a lot of time to just observe and
I
just,
did.
yeah, because,
I did. Even when there was somebody new in one, or if I moved to one gallery, or one different cell block or another, which is kind of like moving from one city to nexus for listeners, you know, I would study my environment for several months before, or study an individual for several months, even before I even just said hello or said anything to them.
Yeah. But did you develop friendships as best you can with
Yeah,
these?
as best I could. I looked at it more as activity partners, but yeah, I mean, there's a general rule in prison: you don't have any friends in prison. That's a general rule. I broke that rule a few times, but more than that, you more have like activity partners. So there was a whole set of people that I used to play basketball with. There was a different set of people that I would play spades with, a different set of people I'd play chess with, and
Right.
another set of people that I would play ping pong, and still another set of people that were sports aficionados. So we might, watch sports on television or, talk sports a little bit.
Right. And what about fightings? Did you get it in any fights or?
Yeah, yes, I did. Maybe like 6 or 7 times. I got beat up. I was, because I was a young kid in a prison. It was, I mean, I got into my mid-20s. I mean, I developed, I got a little stronger. I got a little wiser, and here and there I would come up with a victory or two. But in general, I'm not a fighter. I'm not a fighter. That's not who I am. I'm not going to portray that. So, more often than not, I lost, but I always did the best that I could.
Yeah. And what about visitors, Jeffrey? Did your mom, because you said your mom and grandmother, right? You lived
Yeah.
with your mom.
So yes, I did. So my mother used to come a couple of times, once or twice a month, but that was, and my grandmother would accompany her, but that was initially. So grandma actually passed away after 5 years, 5 or 6 years while I was in prison. So obviously that meant that she wasn't coming anymore. The last 5 or 6 years, my mother came like once every 6 months if I was lucky. I had several sets of aunts and uncles that would, visit, disappear for 3 years, visit, disappear for 3 years. My brother, who was 3.5 years younger than me, came maybe 3 times in 16 years, not at all in the last decade. I had two friends that came to visit me. One person came one time, and that was it. Never saw him again. And I had another friend that stayed in touch with me that it would come up periodically, but that was for 5 years, and then he went into the military, and we lost touch. So, uh, based on all of that, if I was to summarize, I would say that while not literally, in many ways, I essentially did the time by myself.
Now, that's pretty lonely, but let me
Definitely.
ask you, were you able to forgive? Because I'm pretty sure you were probably a little
Yeah,
bit angry at first, right? No.
I certainly was. I was angry at first. Yeah, and I really wasn't even really aware that I was. It only kind of came out as I would meet up with them in person after I was exonerated, it came out. So I didn't, yeah. So that's how that. But one going back to the friend question, there was definitely a friendship that I did make while I was in prison. That was with a prisoner named Frank Sterling, and once Frank was also innocent, and so once every 6 weeks we would get together and try to keep each other going morale wise, and we would also brainstorm about what the next move was to make to try to overturn the conviction and regain our freedom. And Frank was ultimately exonerated through DNA testing after 18 years in prison, so a couple of years after me.
Wow.
And
That's incredible.
lastly, yeah, definitely, it really it was kind of it's kind of unusual in a way. But the last thing I'll say is, in the last couple of years, just desperate for outside contact because of the lack of visitors, I did place an ad in a small newspaper, actually in California, in the Sacramento Bee, and I was looking for a pen pal, just desperate for contact with the outside. But I also had the ulterior motive. I was hoping that at some point they would ask me, well, what are you doing in there, by the way? And that would be my chance to explain I was innocent. And, maybe they would believe me and they could help build a bridge between me and the necessary legal help that I needed to be exonerated. I mean, I had read that had happened in
Hmm.
a number of and other wrongful conviction cases. So I was trying to do the same thing. And so there was somebody who wrote me. His name was Scott Kiley, and I was openly asking the stranger that I didn't know from anywhere And I was openly asking him in the last couple of years, look, should I just quit? Should I give up? Should I just kill myself and be done with this? I'm never going to get out of here. And, so he kind of showed up at the right moment. Right at the end, just as I was about at the end of my rope.
Wow. That's amazing. And I mean, we do hear of stories of, pen pals and, women who really love to fall in love with men in.
I was never so lucky with that. I did fantasize about that. I did fantasize about that for sure. And there were, and in my own mind while I was in prison, I mean, I kind of rotated schools of thought on that. So there was one line of reasoning where, I thought, well, I'm probably not going to find somebody of the caliber that I would want to be involved with. From on the outside, and I can't really see stringing along somebody or using them and tying them up for however many years this lasts. And then when I go home, if I'm not, if it's not up to par, I'm not going to just be miserable the rest of my life. So I don't have the heart to use people. Okay, I don't. I used to see it happening all the time, but I didn't have the heart to do it. So that was my main line of reasoning on that. But listen, don't get me wrong. There were other times when other people were going on visits and getting, they were making phone calls. They were getting letters. Money was sent into them. They were going on visits and they were getting food packages. They even had conjugal visits in New York State. So whereby, if you're married, they could come up on a Friday morning and they would be with you, live with you there was trailers located on the prison grounds, and they would be there until Sunday morning. So there were plenty of times where other people were doing those things, and I felt like the biggest fool in the world with me and my line of reasoning. So, at times I did think about it, and I did place some ads in papers, and they had websites, had Friends Beyond the Wall and other and made pen pals and all these different places. And I tried I tried putting ads and everything, but nobody ever actually responded to me in that way. So another person actually I consulted with somebody once that had done that successfully like a number of times. So I asked them, well, look, I'm not getting any responses, man. What do you think? Here's my ad. You seem to know what you're doing. You seem to have gotten this thing down, and this guy had like a whole huge, several big see-through garbage bags full of letters from so many people. It was ridiculous. So he didn't see anything wrong with the ad. He came up with a theory, which I think was right, in which he said, look, I think that what's happening is these women they're searching and determining what you're incarcerated for. And they see that one of your charges is the rape, right? If it was just the murder, you'd be good to go, but so because of that, I think that's why nobody's answering you,
Right.
so that was my whole thing in terms of that. Yeah. It would have been nice. Don't get me wrong. At the same time, though, I have seen the other end of that. So I know a bunch of exonerees now, and even people on parole, and they're caught in this horrible dilemma because they're with somebody now that in a way they feel a debt to, because that person did hang out with them for like years on end. They did help them. And so they do appreciate that. There is that loyalty aspect to it. But on the other hand, they're not really happy with that person. That's not who's satisfying them on enough of the different levels. And so, what do I do now?
Oh, wow.
And so people have been caught in that dilemma, and some of the people, through the conjugal visits, they actually have children with them, so that complicates things even more.
Wow. Yes. Oh my gosh. There's just so many facets to it, isn't there?
Yes, there really is. So,
It really is.
but no one's ever asked me about that before, by the way. So I kind of enjoyed sharing that aspect of my experience and the different lines of reasoning and all that stuff, when people are going on conjugal visits and I'm just sitting there myself for the afternoon on a Saturday. I felt like the biggest idiot in the world,
Watching their trailer rock, and when you're like, yeah, whatever.
Right. But I'm happy with how that turned out, by the way. I don't have to deal with that complication
That's right.
afterwards.
You don't have to have those regrets or those. Yeah, exactly. So, okay, let's go to, because there's a few things I still want to get in. And if we do it part two, that's fine too.
Sure.
I want to get into where you are today with your
Mm.
career, which I'm just so ecstatic about for you. But I also want to get into now leading up to it. Okay, so you had alluded to the fact that you were losing hope.
Yes.
You were at the end of your rope. You know, years are going by. You don't have a lot of visitors from time to time, but nothing to really touch that innate thing that we have in us
Exactly.
as humans to
Right.
be connected.
Yes. Yes.
So within this time, like your lawyer did like a subpar, I want to say terrible job because you ended up in
Right.
prison. Did he come in? Did you have another lawyer? Like, how did you fight for this? Like, you started reading law books in there? Like,
Yeah.
what
Yeah. I got you. I
happened?
understand your question. Yeah. So I started going to the law library. So here's where somebody like pulled me aside and said, look, I have a paid lawyer. You know, I have one of the best lawyers of all time. He actually had William, the famous civil rights lawyer, William Kunstler, back when he was still alive. He said, look, I have William Kunstler as my lawyer. And even I don't rely exclusively on him. Okay. You have a public defender, someone much less skillful. So it's even more critical for you to go to the law library, to learn the law so that you can give suggestions, so you can keep up to date on what the latest decisions are that may have some implication for your case. So I did start going to the law library and learning the law. And that did give a sense of comfort and empowerment. And
Right.
then I also started collecting articles about people who were exonerated. And there was a number of reasons for that. I mean, the main reason really was I wanted to see what route did they take and who actually helped them as another person to reach out to. But I suppose an additional benefit to that was that it was inspirational, or urged me to continue. But that became a double-edged sword too, because initially when I would read about that, I would like imagine what the scene might look like right outside the prison gate and the celebration. So I kind of vicariously celebrate with them. But at the same time, many of those people were being exonerated by DNA. And so at some point, my mind would shift. And then I would start to feel frustrated because, well, what about me? I'm innocent too. The DNA doesn't match me. Why should I be an exception?
Right.
So that part of it was another thing. But belief in God was one thing. Another thing was that in my mind, I broke everything down to something manageable. In my mind, I wasn't serving a 15 to life sentence. I thought that I was just doing a year or two till the next appeal, which I was sure I was going to win because I was innocent. So there was that. You want to ask a question on that?
Sorry, I just want to, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but so you thought you were okay, year or so, was that
year or two for the next appeal?
So every year that passed by or two for the next
every
appeal?
couple of years for the next 11 years. For the next 11 years, that got 7 appeals got me through 11 years. Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay.
And another thing also was I was desperate to get out of the prison for a couple of hours mentally. So I engaged in this elaborate delusion when I would play basketball or chess or ping pong, and I would pretend like I was a professional player and so were the other people. But it wasn't really like kids fooling around on a playground someplace. I mean, this was more that this is defense mechanism and then the role of euphemism. So it's not the prison warden, it's the superintendent, right? It's not the guards, it's the correction officers. And I'm not going to my prison assignment in the morning or in the afternoon. I'm going to school or I'm going to work. Another thing was that when I listened to sports talk radio, I mean, it wasn't really sports talk radio. That was a lifeline to the outside. In 1998, they allowed us to purchase televisions for in-cell usage in Elmira Correctional Facility. And for the most part, my TV stayed off because I was doing legal work and I was writing letters. And the letter writing comes in because once your appeals are over, the only way back into court is if you can find new evidence that probably would have led to a different outcome. And so because I had no money to hire an attorney or an investigator, hence the letter writing campaign. So for those two reasons, plus from 1998 to 2006, I read 3 or 4 nonfiction books a week. So those are the things that I primarily did while I was in my cell. Having said that, when I purchased the television, there were a few programs that I watched on a weekly basis. And again, I did another delusion. So I would watch like a program and I would pretend like I was visiting with friends.
Right.
There was the pen pal. I mentioned the Frank. So all those were. And the last thing I'll mention is that I sometimes collected pictures of various nature scenes. And there was a square box on one of the prison walls where, per prison rules, you were allowed to hang things up there. And so I would use this awful toothpaste that the state made and provided you with. I would use it as like a glue, as an adhesive, to tape up all these nature pictures. And sometimes I would kind of travel there mentally.
Yeah.
So all those things were how I got through. I had to keep fighting off feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, thoughts of giving up, suicidal ideation. You know, it was as much a psychological and emotional battle as it was actually in the courts.
Well, I'm really thankful that you had that kind of imagination and that mindset, because this is the devil's playground, right? And
Yes.
it's the only place he can get in to discourage us. And so the fact that you were able to, and I'm sure it didn't happen all the time for 16 years. I'm sure there are times that you gave him a foothold in there, but
yeah, of course.
The fact
Definitely.
the fact that you were able to put your mind in these different places, I think that's amazing. And that's really good technique for other people, not just in prison, but anywhere in life. Like, put yourself somewhere, it's going to get better. It's going to get better. And then it doesn't. So what do? Right? You have so many experiences that you can help so many people with that. I'm just amazed at that mindset to carry you through. But
well, another aspect of that, though, was that I knew that nobody that I already knew was coming to my rescue. So I knew I was going to have to try to, find somebody else and convert them into like a champion, and then they connect me to the legal services that I needed. And so in order to maximize my chances of that happening, I had to hold it together. I didn't have the luxury of losing my mind.
that concludes episode 1 with Jeffrey Deskovic. What an amazing story. We just heard how he got arrested, why he got arrested, what happened during those years. Now we're going to head into episode 2, where we learn the process of what he went through to get exonerated through DNA, what he did after his release, and where he is now. There is so much more to go. So join us for episode 2 on This Is Your City with Jeffrey Deskovic.